Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We have sorted out the technical issues that we have. So we have colleagues joining online as well. So let me just introduce myself. For those who were not here during the day, my name is Veronica Ruiz. I'm the program manager for resilience for IUCN, which stands for the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And today we are here co-organizing this event together with IISD, my colleague Veronica Lo, Senior Policy Advisor for IISD, and then also with all of you, the community of practice for nature-based solutions for adaptation here in Canada. So before we start, because this morning I forgot, I will give you some housekeeping rules. So exits, we have exits over here, there, or if you need the toilet emergency, also in this side at the left to the elevator. And we have French, English interpretation, so if you need to grab the headset, they are here in the back, and online colleagues also, you can choose your preferred channel. And the event will be recorded and then uploaded in the web page for the community of practice. Before we are starting, we go into the discussions on nature-based solutions and handing over to Veronica. I would like to give a summary of what we have been doing here today. Some of you have been here since 8:30 or 9 a.m. So today we kick off the joint work across all the projects from the Paneling for Climate portfolio, including NAPSA. NAPSA is the project coordinated by IUCN, which will be providing technical support to all the projects under the portfolio P4C, plus other nature-positive projects. So today we have a very productive day, and I have to say this is only the beginning of the journey, which will last till March 2026. So we have 2.5 years to work together on how to leverage nature-based solutions and capitalize of the work that all of you will be doing on the ground on NBS together with your partners and local communities. So over to you, Veronica. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vero. So we're confusing you as much as possible by having two Veronicas from two different organizations co-facilitate this. But as Vero mentioned, thank you very much for staying with us, the people in the room and also online, for your patience as we start a little bit later than we planned. I have to say thank you a lot, Vero. Also, I had the pleasure of joining this morning's workshop, and it was really interesting to hear about experiences on the ground and implementing NBS from different organizations. And that is really the purpose of this community of practice, of sharing experiences and insights and learning from each other. And today we have the pleasure of co-organizing with IUCN in this beautiful space. So just to provide a bit of a background on the community of practice for those who are not aware, this is the 4th time we're convening in this beautiful space. And in this space, we've had other community of practice events, but we'd like to come back here as well. And in the previous events, we've partnered with the Aga Khan Foundation Canada, who was itself a member of the community of practice, to take a deep dive into nature-based solutions, but with a focus on gender equality, social inclusion, and biodiversity co-benefits. So the community of practice was conceptualized. Members of the C4D network, the Canadian Coalition on Climate and Development, together with Global Affairs Canada, came together and started pitching ideas, trading suggestions for having a space for organizations in Canada to learn and share from each other on nature-based solutions. And now, over the course of 2 years, we've held several events, and we have a steering committee made up with diverse organizations, including Indigenous organizations, that's helping to shape a vision and a plan for activities and events for the community of practice. So anyone is welcome to join the community of practice. You can check out our webpage where you can find a way to sign in, to sign up as members, and you can also find some information on events and some resources that might be of relevance to you. So I'd just like to provide a brief overview of today's agenda. We have an exciting lineup of speakers with us, and just trying to get my pointer to work, and it's not really cooperating. There we are. I think we had another slide up, but we'll just, if we give our amazingly patient tech crew a bit of time, they can get that up. And here's the snapshot of our different speakers today. We are going to have the pleasure of welcoming Stewart Maginnis here with us today as a Deputy Director General at IUCN, and he's going to kick off the discussion by giving his perspectives on inclusive approaches to NBS implementation. Then we're going to hear a presentation by Kelsey Scarfone to share perspectives from the Métis National Council on considering the rights of Indigenous peoples and why that looks different from local community engagement. And Kelsey's intervention is going to help frame and provide context for our next segment, which involves knowledge sharing from members of the community of practice. And we're going to hear from ACTED, from the UN International Fund on Agriculture, otherwise known as IFAD, and also from Plan Canada. We'll learn from their experiences on community engagement on the ground through different initiatives that they're leading. So then we'll open the floor up to questions. We'll have people online are welcome to pitch some questions, and then we'll also have questions from people in the room with us. And then we're going to have IUCN and Global Affairs Canada help us wrap up, provide some key insights, and we'll then open the floor to networking and connecting with each other over some refreshments. So now I'd like to introduce Stewart Maginnis, who will join us to give us a keynote presentation. Stewart Maginnis, I had a nice chat with him over lunch, and he has nearly 40 years of experience in sustainable development and biodiversity conservation, and he's also lived in Tanzania, Sudan, Ghana, and Costa Rica while conducting conservation fieldwork. He led the development and promotion of forest landscape restoration, or FLR. It's one of the first purpose-built nature-based solutions, to which over 60 countries have committed more than 210 million hectares of forest landscape restoration under the Bond Challenge. And he and his team at IUCN have worked over the last 12 years on defining the concept of nature-based solutions and promoting it and supporting its application to climate change and food and water security and disaster risk reduction. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Stewart to come up here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you, and we are meeting here on the traditional unceded lands of the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe people. I just really want to appreciate their stewardship of the lands, of nature that we're here on. And as I'll highlight later on in my speech, to also reinforce the point that nature-based solutions was not invented in 2007, that it was, at the very best, it was described, and was described on the sorts of practices that many Indigenous peoples and local communities have been applying for millennia. So I'd like to start off by saying a big thank you to GAC for the opportunity here and for fostering this fantastic community of practice meeting, which is convened by IISD and IUCN. It's really rewarding to witness such a gathering of practitioners coming together from different disciplines, different perspectives, different geographies, working through the challenges of applying nature-based solutions. In fact, Veronica, I was just reflecting, you said, I've been working for 12 years. It's not, it's 15 years. So you can think of NBS now, at least described NBS, should I say, it's in its troublesome teenage years at the minute. So starting to cut out in itself, but still needing some support from all of us to set it in the right direction. The interesting thing is communities of practice on NBS are being established in a wide range of geographies in different countries, some focusing around different themes and applications. For example, nature-based solutions in the urban context, nature-based solutions in regenerative agriculture. And so they're in universities and down at national and subnational level. And I think this is really, really important, and this is important for this group as well, because effective NBS requires multi-sectoral collaboration. Everyone has a role to play. It's not just a topic that is limited to conservationists or others working around natural resources. It really needs that insight and collaboration. So, as I said, IUCN, with its members and its commissions, has been working on nature-based solutions since about 2009. In 2017, we all got very excited because our time had come, and there was an article, not only an article, an editorial in the Nature journal, the science journal, on nature-based solutions. Unfortunately, it started off by saying, unless you work in IUCN, you've probably never heard of this. But it went on then, and then made a few salient observations about why it might be important. I highlight that because that was only 7 years ago, and as I say, as the editorial started off, it was correct. Not very many people had heard of nature-based solutions, unless a very, very small cluster in the broader IUCN membership and across our commissions. And now, 7 years later on, we see it's acknowledged in the 3 Rio Conventions. It has, 2 years ago, UNEA agreed a multilateral definition that very closely came from the one that IUCN had crafted a few years beforehand. It's embedded in many projects. We see it coming in increasingly referred to in national strategies like MBSAPs and NDCs. So nature-based solution has really exploded in profile over the last 7 years. So it sort of got me thinking, well, why is that the case? Why has NBS started to gain so much traction? And I think there's 3 things that I would highlight and sort of put to you that why at least may contribute in part to this. The first thing, as I just mentioned, is it's not new. IUCN, the union of our state and government agency and subnational jurisdictions, indigenous peoples and NGOs, our commissions, we did not invent NBS. I want to be very clear on that. Rather, I think we went through a process of actually describing the term and reinforcing that nature had a fundamental role in helping to address the needs of society and those challenges that increasingly we're facing. But it is based on the long history and practices of communities and indigenous peoples across the world who have used and where nature is part of their way of living, part of their way of life, and being able to describe that and saying we shouldn't forget in our very sectoral, our very siloed world that there are other ways of being able to deploy and use well-managed and healthy ecosystems to solve some of our major challenges. And that fact that it's described rather than created, I think also means that it reinforces the point that nature-based solutions needs different types of knowledge. It's not something that's been cooked up in a university campus and then put into a series of norms and practices. It is, I say, it does draw from different types and different forms of knowledge. And again, in particular, I'll acknowledge the role of local practice from communities, indigenous peoples, and how they have harnessed their unique knowledge of their relationship with nature. That, I would say, has another implication, as it means that the promotion of nature-based solutions by outside parties must go beyond simply ensuring that there's adequate safeguards for the rights of communities. Safeguarding is an ethical foundation, but it's not enough. And rather, that in applying nature-based solutions, it must work proactively with and support the agency of those communities and be framed by their cultural context and build on their ways of living with nature. And I think actually, again, I would say, and from sort of what I've been, I said to Selena, I was a bit of an interloper sitting at the back, listening to what some of the conversations today. What I've heard is that is very much the approaches that we see through the Partnering for Climate initiatives. The second reason why I think that nature-based solutions is really sort of has gained so much traction is that it really fundamentally challenges one of the major constraints, I think, of modern society, and is that we have to address and solve problems in a highly sectoral, highly siloed manner. We solve one problem at a time. You've got specialists working in one area, and they will pursue their goals. The problem we know about this is that as you solve one problem, you leave several other problems in its wake. Over 40 years ago, I studied agriculture at Queen's in Belfast, and I kept one of the textbooks to remind me of just how endemic this sectoral training is for professional life, and it was called, I don't need to explain anymore, it was called Fertilizing for Maximum Yield. That was it. And so this is a real challenge. I mean, these sectoral approaches are causing many of the challenges that we are actually facing today. They may be short-term, but they do not give us that long-term sustainability. So I think many of us feel like that and feel sort of the passion that we want to break beyond that. And that's another reason why I think nature-based solutions, which emphasizes we have to have integrated approaches, multidisciplinary approaches, bringing in different stakeholders, is actually gaining traction. And the final reason why I think nature-based solutions is gaining traction is because it's effective and it's accessible and can deliver an impact at different levels, especially at the local community level. It works with the resources that are available, that are at hand. In other words, the barriers to entry are actually quite low. However, so I think those are some of the reasons why I think we're really starting to see this momentum, why you are here as a community of practice along with other communities of practice. But I also think, as I said, that nature-based solutions is 15, so it's in its troublesome, petulant teenage years. And so there are some issues that I do think we need to confront and we need to acknowledge that still need to be addressed. There's a long list, and probably if we took a survey here, there would be maybe a couple of dozen. I'm going to focus just on two at the minute, really for the sake of time. The first is, I think, a concern that nature-based solutions can be co-opted by more powerful actors, and that the intention of actually really of working with the agency and empowering and seeing the benefits flow to local communities can be removed. This is a risk, and it's especially where we work with degraded and undervalued resources, and all of a sudden they start to gain value and they attract the attention of others. And this was one of the reasons why IUCN worked through to try and frame a global standard for nature-based solution, was really to try and provide the sort of guidance that would on some of these key elements, that to avoid some of the challenges that we saw just a few years previous with initiatives like REDD+. The standard really, I think in the standard, and particularly in this issue of really ensuring that benefits flow to those who steward and manage the resource, is that there's two criteria in particular that I'd like to flag up. One is that criterion one on clarifying what nature-based solutions is and who it's for, what problems being solved and who are the beneficiaries. That is a fundamental sort of requirement. And the other is the criterion 5 on social inclusion. And again, I'll mention the point I've made before. It's not just about safeguarding, it's not just making sure that there's adequate consultation. It is about recognizing and engaging with the energy of the local communities and being able to put them at the forefront of driving forward those benefits. The second issue that, again, I think worries many people is that MBS simply provides a smokescreen for business as usual, particularly when it comes to climate mitigation. And I would say there's two things we need to consider here. Number one is MBS is not REDD+. I was to quote the musical Hamilton, I was in the room when it happened, when we started to try and shape and describe nature-based solutions back in 2008, 2009. And I think one of the things, I'll be absolutely honest, the poster child we had up that we wanted to avoid was REDD+, where we saw rights and benefits being encroached from communities. However, I'd also say that where REDD+, where we saw the rights encroached from communities, but also actually that it was that what was happening was it often was being deployed as a business as usual vehicle. And I think it's worthwhile just flagging up that that the vast majority of MBS applications are focused on, including what we've heard here today, they're about helping to strengthen the resilience of communities to climate-induced flooding or droughts, or improving water stewardship and water security, or improving the sustainability of agricultural practices through regenerative agriculture and agroecology. So yes, it's true that nature-based solutions does enhance the function, because nature-based solutions enhances the functionality and the diversity of natural and modified ecosystems, it will increase the carbon content, and that's a good thing, but it does not necessarily mean that they've got to be translated into carbon credits for the voluntary market. That's not saying that they should be always precluded, but it is actually, I think the one thing is that we've got to focus on that nature-based solutions are being deployed for so many more purposes than just carbon mitigation. The second thing about the concerns on this, that MBS becomes a smokescreen, is that I really do think that there is increasing agreement in many quarters, and I'm sure probably here, that in particular, I'd say particularly in light of the shocking news that came today, the realization that 2023 was the first year where we had a year-long breach on exceeding the 1.5 degree threshold, that MBS are not substitutes for the rapid phase out of fossil fuels, that MBS have got so many more applications, but this is a misuse of their potential and their value. So many organizations, IUCN included, have been vocal on this, and I'd really respectfully encourage all of us to make sure that we add our voices to this. There's lots of potential for MBS, but acting as a vehicle for carbon, as a mechanism for to put credits into a voluntary market is pretty low down the list. So in conclusion, I think there are these concerns reinforce the problem that we really need to be clear on what MBS is. And I would also suggest that, and just maybe a last couple of words on this, that this is partly the reason why IUCN worked with many members and ran a consultation to try and put in place a global standard for MBS. Again, I'll say it's not perfect, but it actually has, it does actually really lay out the direction for where we need to travel. I'd also, maybe just the final words on this would be, even when the development of the standard, it was really underpinned by good intentions. As I said, we didn't want to go down the road of seeing the misuse of natural resources and the expropriation of the role of ecosystem services. And that was what drove that. And we did consult extensively. We did 800 inputs from over 100 countries. But it was also at a different time. It was, the communities of practice were much smaller. It's 2017, 2018, 2019. And I think one of the things that is important now is learning and adaptive management. Indeed, those of you familiar with the standard will remember that criterion 7 is all about the importance of building adaptive management. So one of the things that I just want to conclude with is that IUCN is committed, and we're to periodic revision of the standard in an open and transparent and inclusive manner. And we really want to work with the different communities of practice on the lessons we've learned to actually bring this in to improve the standard, to improve its applicability across different situations, and really make sure that it remains relevant. So, in conclusion, I'd say that we need to work and learn together. MBS becomes more effective if it draws on all sources of knowledge and experience, and this is particularly essential if MBS is going to provide these effective frameworks for integrated approaches, which I do honestly think are absolutely critical to address some of the emergencies that we're actually facing. So without much ado, thank you very much. That was, and I look forward to the rest of this session.
Thank you so much, Stewart. I think many of our participants here really appreciate how you illuminated the process of conceptualizing NBS from its infancy through to its petulant teenage years, and now the process of revising and improving the global standards. So it's very interesting. Thank you. And also how you highlighted the theme of inclusion and multi-sectoral approaches. And it's very topical to today's discussion, as it relates to the challenges of different interpretations of NBS and what that means for rights holders and stakeholders and local communities. So that provides a nice seg into our next presentation from the Métis National Council, who are generously providing their time to come and explain to us, what are the rights of Indigenous peoples, how that differs from what local community engagement looks like, and why this terminology really does matter. So I have the pleasure of welcoming Kelsey Scarfone from the Métis National Council. She is a conservation policy advisor, and her areas of focus include protected areas, supporting the Métis Guardians, coordinating bilateral tables on nature between the Métis nations and Canada, as well as advocating for the Métis Nation internationally by following negotiations under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So welcome, Kelsey.
Okay, thank you everyone so much for that warm welcome. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, I always have to kind of tip this up a little bit. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's good to be gathered with you all on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. Thank you so much to Veronica and the team who's been organizing this afternoon for welcoming me. I just want to start by saying, as my bio indicated, I work on conservation policy on behalf of the Métis Nation, and my director, Erin Myers, is actually the community of practice member who participates more regularly, so I'm just really happy to be here on her behalf, and she sends her regrets, but hopefully I can provide some good information today and tell you a little bit about why it's important we make the distinction between Indigenous peoples and local communities. So for those of you who don't know, the Métis are one of 3 distinct Indigenous peoples in Canada, and I'll just tell you a little bit about the Métis National Council before I get into the substance of my presentation. So the MNC represents the Métis Nation nationally and internationally. We receive our mandate from the democratically elected Métis governments in Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. So we specifically move forward on the priorities and actions that those governing members of our council direct us on. And our mandate specifically is the national and international level. So our long-term goal is that Métis people are healthy, resilient, grounded in their culture and language, and thriving as individuals and members of their Métis families and communities. So with a key level of our work being the international space, we do quite a bit across the United Nations system. So we're heavily involved in the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, CBD, and others that emerge as priorities like Ramsar and the UN Water Conference. Specifically, my area of expertise is the Convention on Biological Diversity, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today when we get into terminology here, just because it is my focus. So I'm not an expert on nature-based climate solutions. I dabble, but today really we are kind of focusing on rights-based language and terminology. So to start this conversation, we do have to start at the beginning, and that goes all the way back to 1992. So imagine the Blue Jays winning the World Series, Bill Clinton was president. That's how far back we have to go to really understand where this conversation begins, and with the Rio Earth Summit. So I'm sure many folks are familiar with that summit, resulting in the establishment of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the Rio Declaration is where we start to see Indigenous peoples' terminology being grouped with local communities, where Principle 22 states Indigenous peoples and their communities and other local communities have a vital role in environmental management. So I do have it directly quoted here on the slide, but you'll notice that this text does include the separation of Indigenous peoples and their communities and local communities, but subsequent texts that emerged from the Rio Earth Summit start to really pair Indigenous peoples and local communities together as one term, as a monolith. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So of course, as I mentioned, the Convention on Biological Diversity was a result of the Rio Summit. And directly in its convention text, we start to see the combination of terms between Indigenous peoples and local communities. For those familiar with CBD, you'll know that Article 8J is where we specifically see this terminology. And this is convention text. And I'll talk a little bit about why that matters in a second. But it states that innovations and practices of Indigenous and local communities embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, on and on and on. So this is where we see the two terms really come together. It's important to note it's convention text because this means we do have to use this terminology until it's changed in the convention itself. So this is what is referenced in targets in the new work that we do under CBD, because we have to come back to convention text. And I say that just to say that just because it's convention text in the CBD does not make us beholden to use this terminology in other multilateral agreements, in our own organizations, in the work we do as individuals. We can update the terminology that we use in line with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that's where I'll transition our presentation to now. Fast forwarding 30 years, more than 30 years since some of this text was first used, I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like now post UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few recommendations that are existing in the last couple of years by the entities that we really turn to for implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So the expert mechanism in their 48th session to the Human Rights Council noted that one of the concerns expressed with Indigenous peoples is a tendency to lump in local communities within international conventions and other multilateral agreements. Specifically, I want to draw your attention to this part of the slide where they note that this development may have the impact of undermining Indigenous peoples' rights under the Declaration, in particular, their right to self-determination. And I'll just refer you to Article 4 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that is really specific about the autonomy of Indigenous peoples in their own international affairs and to represent themselves. And so when we have these terms like Indigenous peoples and local communities, IPLC, as if they're one thing in one group, how can Indigenous peoples exercise their right to self-determination and autonomy? That would imply they're also speaking for local communities, which doesn't serve either group very well, because local communities have the right and deserve to define themselves for themselves and represent themselves internationally as they see fit. It's not appropriate for Indigenous peoples to be doing that in a overarching and all-encompassing way. So this is the first place we see this come up in the last couple of years. I want to keep it really recent because we went all the way back to the 90s already. And then again in 2023, like just earlier last year, the Permanent Forum, another entity we look to for Indigenous rights, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues reiterates a call that a distinction be made between Indigenous peoples and local communities, and that all UN entities, and especially concerning the environment, biodiversity, and climate, they're sort of specifically calling out the Convention on Biological Diversity here, are encouraged to stop using that term in connection with Indigenous peoples. And I think that this recommendation can kind of make you sit up in your chair, because they recommend the term Indigenous peoples and local communities would be abolished. But I think the spirit of the recommendation here is that we stop grouping everyone together as if it's the same exact thing, and that we make distinctions in the way that we write our text. Later last year, we actually saw a rare joint statement from the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights, and the expert mechanism together urged all UN entities in their method of work to refrain from conflating, associating, combining, or equating Indigenous peoples with non-Indigenous entities, such as minorities, vulnerable groups, or local communities, and request that parties to treaties related to environment, biodiversity, and climate stop using the term local communities alongside Indigenous peoples. So I want to just point out here that it's not about local communities themselves, it's about being grouped in and conflated with other groups of people in general. So other minorities, vulnerable groups, it's not to say that those groups don't deserve special attention, recognition, engagement. It's just to say that the rights for Indigenous peoples are distinct. They are defined in the United Nations Declaration. And it's not a service to any of the groups to be creating these catch-all terms. So I just really do urge you to look at this joint statement. It's a really good resource to better understand this issue. And I'll just start to wrap up here by saying that terminology matter. I mean, I've said a lot of it along the way. It matters because we also don't know the legal status of local communities. It really is up to those local community representatives to define themselves for themselves and let us know in the international community how they would like to be engaged and what their rights are. We do know that we have the UN Declaration, so the rights of Indigenous peoples are distinct and defined. In Canada, this is very concerning anytime I see language about local communities, because that's certainly not defined in any legal status in Canada, and there is a constitutional right for Indigenous peoples in Section 35 of our Constitution here in Canada. So, but regardless of that, we still see this terminology come into domestic policy and texts. So it's very easy once we start using it for it to seep into places that don't legally make sense, can be inappropriate. So this is why we give this presentation, but it is very important in the international community as well. And I just want to recall what I mentioned earlier in terms of Article 4 of the UN Declaration, the right to self-determination. This is a real barrier to implementing that article of the UN Declaration, because self-determination and advocacy for Indigenous peoples at the international level needs to happen in a self-determined way, and there is that defined right to do so. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about considerations for engagement. So urging everyone to use the declaration as a guide, but also consider when you're approaching Indigenous nations in your work, consider the governance structure who represents who? I think this is really important. The Métis National Council, like I said, we have a mandate to national and international policy issues. We have an accountability mechanism back to Métis citizens. So when we have these policy conversations, we do have that democratically elected mandate to represent the Métis Nation, whereas getting the opinion of one or two individuals isn't really fulsome engagement lined up to that governance structure of the community you're looking to engage. We can also only move as fast as the speed of trust. Relationships are really important in this work, and I'm sure there'll be really great recommendations from the subsequent presenters on things specific to the kind of engagement that you all do. But since we were starting to head in this direction, I wanted to just provide a slide with a couple of my thoughts. But yeah, I hope in terms of takeaway, I know that this is a sensitive topic. I just really want to reiterate that self-determination is at the heart of this issue, and for all, and it does a real disservice to so many groups when we start to lump everyone together in one mega term. And I think using it where we don't have to is problematic, and we need to really look at improving the way that we talk about communities and talk about Indigenous peoples. So that's it for me, and thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. I think everybody really appreciated that. You really explained it in very clear terms, I think, on how important it is to really understand your engagement methods and to understand the landscape that you're working on. So thank you very much for that. And I wonder if we might take one or two questions. Because we started late, we're sort of running short on time, but I think we can take a question online and we can take a question in the room. And we also understand that people may be uncomfortable with asking certain questions on this topic. So we also do have an opportunity during our networking session where you can approach Kelsey, and she's kindly offered to take up any questions that anyone has. I wonder if we might check online, Uju, to see if there are any questions. Okay, great. There is one from Carrie, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Kelsey. Carrie Max, Global Affairs Canada, and finally I have a sense historical. I'm really glad you took us through that. I did want to ask, in some of my conversations with, for example, the IUCN, where they have Indigenous members built into the structure, and a lot of what they've done reflects the input from Indigenous members. Now I realize that that's on the NBS side, not on terminology, and the terminology does not reflect that. But what is your advice when we're dealing with Indigenous communities that don't decide to represent themselves as Indigenous? I think the Maasai is an example from time to time. They may use terms like ethnic communities. What would your take be in those situations? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. And of course, the communities that you're referencing, like the Maasai, would be the best suited to answer that. So I'm not going to speak for them by any means. But I will just say that, the United Nations Declaration, one of the articles is about communities, nations identifying themselves for themselves. And so that is their right to do so. Those rights are still protected in the UN Declaration. So I hope that's helpful. But I think it's something that does come up. I know that there are many states who might not necessarily recognize Indigenous peoples in their borders, but the UN Declaration still protects their rights. So, yeah.
We have a question over here. Oh, no, never mind, sorry.
Kelsey, so let's give a big round of applause. And I think we'll keep these great insights that Kelsey has provided on behalf of Métis National Council as we move into our next segment. Here we're going to actually hear from members of the community of practice on the theme of community engagement, which is a common thread through many of our projects and what we work on in the NBS space. So today we're going to hear from 3 different organizations, from ACTED, from the UN International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD, and also from Plan Canada, speaking from a range of different experiences in different ecosystems and countries. So I'm going to introduce each of the speakers as they come up in turn, and we're starting with Aaron Brown. He's a Project Development Officer at ACTED Canada. In his role, he brings knowledge from ACTED country offices to inform and enhance practices in the North, fostering a reciprocal learning environment. Alongside his work, Aaron is a passionate Toronto Raptors fan, fun fact, and he brings the same level of enthusiasm and commitment to his love for basketball as he does to his work on international development. And he's going to test your knowledge on NBS at the end of his presentation. He's got a fun and interactive quiz, so he'll test your knowledge and how closely you are listening to Stewart Maginnis' presentation. So we look forward to that. So welcome up here, Aaron.
Hello, everybody. Happy International Development Week. Happy Black History Month. While I'm presenting, let's just think about all the activists and all the fights that we put up to have these 2 weeks, 1 month, 1 week recognized. So let's keep that in the back of our head. Today, I am presenting about Thrive, which is a program that we have here at ACTED, and I will be focused specifically on the community engagement elements that we have that make it unique and beneficial. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have programs that are similar. I might not be saying revolutionary things, but keep in mind things that might be different, things that might be the same, feedback for myself, but also feedback for the projects that you're running. That's what this community of practice is all about. So what Thrive is it stands for the Towards Holistic Resilience in Vulnerable Communities. So it's a framework for resilient systems in agropastoral areas, and it recognizes the interconnected dynamics between ecosystems, livelihoods, and social cohesion. So it serves as a framework to support some of the most vulnerable climate-affected communities in the world who are dealing with landscape degradation and the effects of climate change. So we currently we have 12 Thrive projects going in Jordan, Syria, Nigeria, Uganda, Somali region, Niger, and South Sudan. It can also be used in an emergency context, which is something that ACTED does, so it's easily transitioned to provide cash for work projects on top of the Thrive programming. And it can be used as a global framework that can be replicated in one region and be used in another region. So where do these take place? We're currently working in rangelands of the world. So these are open countries used for grazing and hunting animals. So think of big pastoral areas, nothing too hilly or things like that. So this covers 54% of the terrestrial surface of the world. So it's quite large, and you can see the identified areas that this project would thrive in. So there's 3 kind of pillars of Thrive, and they're meant to start at different periods, but all build off each other and be as sustainable as possible. So I'll go through these quickly today, and then go through the community engagement aspects of each. So the first one is called Revive, which focused on ecosystem restoration to build healthy ecosystems and development of livelihoods. So that is at the bottom. Then Emerge comes in, which focuses on building agro businesses, developing a thriving market to sell agricultural goods. And then finally Integrate, which focuses on social cohesion to support local governance in sharing resources, land use, and social cohesion. So I'll go into each of these a little more in depth. This was a slide that I had, but I got rid of it because of timing. As you can see, there's a lot. Okay, Revive. So Revive, again, stands for something else, regenerative earthworks and vegetation for vibrant ecosystems. So the way that it works, mimics natural patterns applied to agricultural production with a deliberate effort to restore degraded landscapes and soils. So the idea is to make the soil and the environment as fertile as possible using natural resources and nature-based solutions. So here are kind of the 4 stages of Revive. First is community engagement, so engaging, of course, finding out what the issue is. Then earth harvesting, earthworks. Then it goes to vegetation, and then finally grazing. So this is kind of the path that we look for that mimics natural processes. And it's not just meant to decrease degradation, desertification, but also restore natural balance to land that can be used to grow food and provide income. So it restores livelihoods through improved practices, intensified production, sustainable methods, climate-smart approaches, vegetation and nutrition-sensitive agricultural production. And so in this first pillar, we are always working to engage communities, and that's one of the most important things that we have at ACTED. We're always working to have a close relationship with the people that we work with. So the communities must be at the center of this pillar. So the first way that we interact with communities is through landscape degradation assessments and social evaluation. So understanding the context in terms of the environment, but also the social pillars that are at play within the community. Then there's the identification of groups for training and communities. So throughout this program, we really try to not invent new groups or create new groups to cause conflict, but build capacities of existing groups. So these are like farmer field schools, agro-pastoral fields, people that are open to receiving help. And then finally, or second last, is land use and social planning. So again, finding the relevant stakeholders who are open to having these interventions on their land and their properties. And then finally is exchange visits and dialogue. So after a certain amount of time, the communities will start bumping into other communities. That's just a fact of natural resources and natural resource management. So engaging with other communities and strengthening those relationships as well. So that's the first part of Revive, very focused on reviving the landscapes and ecosystems. The second is Emerge. Again, it stands for something. Enhancing market economies for rural growth and empowerment. So this is a very pillar focused a lot on income generation and agricultural development. So as you can see here, we don't focus on one sector of the agricultural supply chain, but all different areas to support them and kind of bring up the community as a whole. So the first one is at the bottom, so it goes from smallest to biggest. The bottom is households with agricultural livelihoods. So those people are usually most accessible and open to incorporating our practices. So we do things like improving agricultural practices, helping with infrastructure, introducing climate-smart technology. Then we move up to the agricultural entrepreneurs. So these are people, a little bit of a smaller subset of the population, but they have the most potential and willingness to diversify their incomes, take risks, and move towards a market-oriented production. So we support them in any way possible. Then the next level is the cooperatives and farmer groups. So helping them form collective action and kind of get organized, also allowing for bulk purchasing, negotiations and other opportunities. And then finally, supporting existing agricultural businesses. So offering support to increase jobs and then green their operations as well. So in terms of this pillar, there's again a lot of community engagement that is necessary for it to work. The first is community engagement and consultation. So understanding who is in which stage of each of the categories I mentioned before, but also understanding how they work together and kind of what is important to these communities. Then another important thing is the agricultural practice and productivity assessment. So we don't want to come in and advocate for things that aren't of interest to the local community or of not even possible to grow. So I've seen that in development context, sometimes people come in with seeds and the people don't eat that food in that area. So we make sure to do an assessment on kind of what are the key drivers of the food systems, what are the key agricultural production systems, and are these green, how these can be further greened. And then there's the prioritization and value chain assessment. So this kind of builds off what I was saying, but understanding the overall value chain, who are the big players, what are the shortcomings, what are the weaknesses, and how they can be improved. Especially coming off the Revive pillar, how we can use those findings and those best practices to implement the value chain. And then finally is integrate, and this is very focused on community engagement and how we can integrate nature-based solutions and the work that we've been doing into the broader community. So again, it stands for something. It stands for intercommunal exchange to develop robust agropastoral transboundary ecosystems and economies. That's a mouthful. But social cohesion and stability reinforces environmental restoration and market gains, allowing for livelihoods to flourish at the community level. So we do this to establish a basis of sharing and best knowledges, best practices, kind of like we're doing in Canada. We're trying to do that in all our projects as well. So in terms of community engagement, ACTED sometimes works in conflict settings and humanitarian crises. So we're always doing a conflict analysis, social assessment to understand kind of what's going on in that community, what different groups there are, what's the history of that group. But also it's not just like a formality that we do kind of at the beginning of the project, but it's an ongoing process to understand the complexities and the moving parts of conflict. There's also a stakeholder analysis and group identification. So who are kind of the leading voices in terms of nature-based solutions, in terms of agriculture, who's are the producers, and who's kind of interested in that type of work. And then finally is community awareness and mobilization. So taking those lessons learned, that kind of excitement, and moving it forwards to the community and to the broader ecosystem. And also just in Canada doing things like this to promote that as well. So we have our part to play. But something interesting of the integrate is community dialogue and exchange visits. So we're always advocating for different communities to get together and exchange ideas. So establishing a dialogue with the community, a people-to-people approach. So we would just host it and have a space for people to come and discuss, but that's kind of the extent of where organizations play a role. So the beneficiaries would have a space to share with each other. They can tell the good, the bad, the ugly, everything. Then there's community exchange visits, so allowing different communities to come and see the different pillars of Thrive, but also share these lessons learned as well. And then strengthening groups or mechanisms for conflict resolution. So as I mentioned before, sometimes there's conflicts in these regions. So using the Thrive and the nature-based solutions as a pillar or as a way to get into these conversations and advocate for conflict resolution and peace. So that's kind of how it relates to triple nexus work in a way. But that is where I'm gonna close it off. So I thank you guys for listening, and I created a little quiz that they're gonna help me get up that we can just do to see where our understanding of nature-based solution is. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Aaron. That was a nice and fun and interactive element. And now we're going to turn to our online representatives from IFAD. I have the pleasure of introducing Alessia Marazzi, who is Environment and Climate Finance Specialist from IFAD, and Alexandra Teixeria, a Rural Development Specialist. So we have pre-recorded the presentations in case there's a connection issue, But with luck, Alessia and Alexandra can stay with us for the live Q&A session that will follow this segment. So Alessia is based in Cairo, and she supports the design and implementation of agricultural and rural development projects across the Middle East and North Africa region, with a focus on small-scale and family farming, climate adaptation, and natural resource management. And her background is in the design, implementation, and evaluation of rural development and food security interventions, both in the field and at global headquarters. And Alexandra is based in Brazil, and she works primarily with gender, social inclusion, and nutrition. And she also designs and oversees rural development projects in the Brazilian semi-arid region that interconnect family farming, food and nutrition security, poverty eradication, social inclusion, and climate adaptation. And she has experience with various sectors in research and advocacy and multi-sectoral partnerships. So let's start with Alessia's presentation, followed by Alexandra.
Everyone, and good evening for whoever is in a different time zone like me. My name is Alessia Marazzi, and I'm an environment and climate specialist for IFAD, based in Cairo, Egypt. And I'm very honored today to be here to present the Climate Resilience Community Village Plans with my colleague Alexandra from Brazil, from the IFAD Brazil country office. So I will be presenting lessons from Sudan, and Alexandra will then follow on with some examples from Brazil. So just going into the details now, I will be presenting what is a CRCVP. So CRCVPs are community action plans with the objective of building the adaptive capacity of communities and focusing on common natural resources. So they're really a powerful tool that identify implementable actions that are intended, as we said, to reduce the community's vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, and at the same time contribute to building resilient livelihood systems. This set of actions are usually time-bound, but at the same time, the process is dynamic. So it considers current and future climatic conditions and is also regularly updated. So to make sure it's really a living document. So what is really interesting about CRCVPs is that they focus on communities. So communities are at the center. And this is really a tool that will empower their members to identify the solutions that can help building resilience. I've put here a set of activities that are usually part of the CRCVPs in Sudan, but of course there's many more. So we have, for example, the registration and legalization of community forests, building capacities in rehabilitation practices and technique, establishing community rangelands, which serve as a fodder buffer for drought seasons, and investing in community water harvesting and storage. So this is just an overview for you to understand what is a climate resilience community village plan. I have here these steps, the main steps for the formulation of a CRCVP, but what I would like to insist on is really the bottom-up and participatory process that really aims at including all members of the community. So the key steps are the first two, where we have generating climate change awareness and conducting a poverty or vulnerability assessment. And this is key because we want the communities to be empowered to increase their awareness on climate change, to understand from them as well what are the impacts that they're suffering from, and what are also the solutions that they've been applying. Being able to recognize what are the current impacts, but also the future ones. And at the same time, it's important to understand how different impacts of climate change are affecting different segments of the population. So also targeting the most marginalized within the communities. It is important to make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind when identifying solutions, and there is not elite capture in that sense. And then we move on with the identification and prioritization of adaptation options. And all this work actually feeds into the CRCVP, the actual plan. Another important point would be the integration into multiple levels of governance, because this, of course, allows to have better coordination with other actors and also ensure that there's no overlapping of activities. but also to have the buy-in of higher levels of governance within the territory. It is important to factor in capacity building to ensure a proper implementation. And then, of course, towards the end, it is important to have an assessment of the CRCVP, of course, substantiated by a sound monitoring and evaluation throughout the implementation. So moving on now, key points in the formulation of CRCVP. What do we need to keep in mind? Seasonality, timelines, community contribution, and implementation capacity. So these are really key. Another point, integrating and valuing different types of knowledge. This is very important to ensure that, sure, we have scientific knowledge that substantiates the actions, but at the same time, they need to be locally relevant. So it's important to have scientific, indigenous knowledge, as well as local knowledge, all integrated. And then finally, as I said already, so the planning process is quite important. So to ensure coordination and building stronger partnerships to also ensure the sustainability of the CRCVP. I will be presenting quickly an example from Sudan, which will give you an idea of the what is the CRCVP concretely. So this example is related to Eastern Sudan, where people traditionally cultivate in the vicinity of their settlements. Over time, of course, and considering the impact of climate change, soil becomes degraded, infertile, and there's also, of course, a decrease in productivity. So cultivation has been moving forward to the wadis, which are not so fertile and quite far, so women are often not allowed to cultivate there. The CRCVP process that was facilitated by IFAD identified terrace construction as a climate resilience nature-based solution to address low rainfall and crop productivity. And we had actually quite interesting results. So the production of sorghum increased from 180 to 630 kilogram per hectare on the terraces. And what was really interesting was also that the food security gains were combined to increase livelihood opportunity for women who were also allowed to cultivate on the terraces because they were much closer to the community. So what we can see here is a CRCVP that does not only identify a solution that is contextual and that's actually build adaptive capacity, but also takes into account the role of women and, tries to identify a solution that works for women as well. And then I have a second example very quickly on rangeland protection. And here again, we have, there was an issue of animal feed shortage, which was due to low rainfall, land degradation, and overgrazing. And the CRCVP process identified several rangeland protection measures that actually ensured limited and controlled grazing. And the results were quite interesting here as well. So in 2011, which was a year of very low rainfall, the protected community rangelands supplied good and abundant dry fodder during the dry season. And here again, the benefits are not just limited then to increased fodder production, but also to marketing opportunities, as this was combined with the creation of storages. So I will conclude here my very brief intervention, and I will hand over to my colleague, Alexandra, who will present more examples from Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alessia. I will complement your presentation on how to do note, now focusing on the lessons from Brazil. And good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. The first thing I would like to highlight is the challenges. We have some constraints when we are implementing and preparing a CRCVP, such as the lack of awareness on climate change and its impacts, the limited knowledge on how to adapt systems at different stakeholder levels, poor community organizations and institutional setups for natural resources management, lack of proper capacity building, inadequate access to technical assistance, weak coordination mechanisms, and low ownership. So sometimes the community level approach may be insufficient and a broader strategy is necessary, such as a basing level approach or some other arrangement. For example, in the Pro-Semi-Arid project in Brazil, we developed a participatory targeting strategy where the sub-projects were organized in rural territories, each of them composed of 3 to 4 contiguous communities. And the territorial investment plans, the CRCVPs, were based on diagnoses of the territorial's environmental, social, and productive status, weaknesses and strengths. And as a result, we had a very effective participation and targeting and demand-driven investments. About the key constituents to the CRCVPs, first one that's very important are the networks. In Brazil, we have a network of cooperatives which is called the Caatinga Network in Bahia, which connect different family farming cooperatives to markets in Brazil and abroad. And they provide technologies and commercial solutions for this collective arrangement. And they also have a strategic commercial spaces specialized in the diversity of projects from the family farming systems. Another group that is very important are the youth. As Alessia has mentioned about women, I focus here on 2 experiences with youth. One is for the PSA project in Bahia as well, where youth from the communities were selected to act as rural community agents, and they worked strengthening the local organizations and supporting the implementation of project activities. And this assured a lot of community ownership, proximity, and trust, as well as sustainability and income generation and job opportunities for youth. Another example, it's the PVSA project in Piauí, where we integrated young rural farmers through the family farming schools, which are based on the alternance pedagogy. They stay in school half the time and the other half in their farms. So all the training they received, for instance, in nutrition education, climate resilience practices, and on how to develop nurseries and agroforest systems, they would apply on their homes and their land. So it was a very important initiative for sensitizing on the importance of preserving the biome. Regarding the prioritization adaptation options, one interesting experience we have in Brazil is the implementation of small-scale social technologies for climate resilience agriculture. They're usually for water access or energy access, and they include, for instance, household cisterns, underground dams, gray water reuse systems, biodigesters, wind and solar systems. And all those that we call social technology, because they are low cost, they are developed and applied in interaction with the population. They are largely tested in the northeast of Brazil, and they frequently are managed by the most vulnerable, such as women, allowing a great improvement in living conditions. They allow also a significant production diversification, impacting on dietary patterns, improving nutrition and food security. Another good example from Brazil is the recatingamento, which is the recovery of degraded areas, the restoration and conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services through the active participation of communities that are responsible for the soil preparation, for fencing, for building the plants nursery, producing and planting seedlings. And as a result of this type of activities that engages the whole community in the adaptation process, there was a recognition of them as guardians of the Caatinga, especially strengthening the forage reserves for the dry season, the protection of water resources. It was also possible to add value to the local biodiversity products, generate new incomes, and strengthen and value the traditional ways of life of the traditional people that live there, which is the Fundo de Pasto communities. Regarding the implementation of the CRCVP, in Brazil, we have created in our projects the social control commissions, which are established in the territories, and they have a consultative approach, and they are used to monitor all the project activities, to mediate conflict, to plan the activities of the rural community agents, and coordinate beyond the limits of that community, but more thinking about the rural territory, which is the conglomerate of 3 to 4 communities. And as a consequence of the social control commissions, we have strengthened the role of project participants, guided and raised awareness of social control mechanisms among the members, raising transparency, sustainability, and local capacities. Also, regarding the step of assessment of the CRCVP progress, one interesting experience from Brazil is the economic ecological analysis of the ecosystems that we call the LUMI method. Because usually at the impact level, you need to show how outcomes are contributing to impacts, such as improvement in livelihoods, decreased in poverty. And with the LUMI method, it was possible to calculate the economic return of those agroecological investments and to identify how the project was contributing to the increased autonomy of the agroecosystems, the social integration of family farmings, including economic, ecological, and political relationships that are usually not considered in conventional economic theory. So just to conclude, there are some lessons learned and strategic recommendations. First of all, the CRCVPs require a comprehensive and integrated multidimensional strategy, combining climate risk management and adaptation activities with other investments, to increase, for instance, agricultural productivity and the access to financial services. Also, it should be the socio-ecological resilience is essential. The strengthening of climate resilience should be seen as a broader human development framework, addressing all the multiple perspectives, economic, productive, social, environmental, and political. Another aspect that we took from the lessons from Brazil is the importance of the technical assistance. It has a lot of transformative potential and enhances the sustainability of investments and the diversification in production. And finally, it's fundamental if we are to do the CRCVPs with the technical assistance continually supporting the communities. This personnel needs to have capacity building on climate resilience. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alessia and Alexandra. I know that you're online right now for our Q&A, so we have one more presentation to go. There's no quiz, but there's one question, and whoever gets this right can have my pen. What is a CRCVP? And hint, it starts with climate resilient. Any takers? Climate resilient community village plans from what I understand, and I will keep my pen then. So we've had a range of experiences from drier ecosystems on land, and now we get to dip our toes into the water a little bit. So it's very exciting to hear about some coastal and marine conservation initiatives. And for that, I have the pleasure of welcoming Plan Canada. This is Annick Gillard-Bailetti, the Technical Advisor of Marine and Coastal Conservation and Management. Annick is an international development expert with over 2 decades of leadership experience in prominent international NGOs, focusing on gender transformative strategies for the integration of sustainable development and climate action. And she's also the founder and CEO of Verde Consulting, where she concentrates on climate adaptation with a strong focus on gender responsive nature-based solutions. Annick oversees program management and provides guidance for PLAN's gender-responsive coastal resilience project in Kenya. So welcome, Annick, and please come on up.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Nice to be here. I don't have a fun quiz, unfortunately, today, but nor do I have a pen to give away. So you'll just have to, you'll just have to listen to me. I do have a fun 2-minute video if time allows and if IT allows at the end. So we'll see how that goes. So very happy to be here. Thanks again for having me. I'm newer to the NBS community practice, but really happy to be here to represent PLAN International's COSME project, which stands for the Conservation and Sustainable Management of Coastal and Marine Ecosystems. I'll be speaking today about a particular community engagement experience or practice that we will be using in the project. Obviously, it's still early days, and that is community-based ecological mangrove restoration, or CBEMR, to add to our acronyms list. So very briefly, just a quick overview of the COSME project. I know this was presented, I think, at the last community practice meeting, but just as a quick overview, COSME is being implemented in Kenya and Tanzania, in the Kwale and Kilifi counties of coastal Kenya, so 65 coastal and terrestrial communities, and in 45 communities along the border regions of Tanzania and Kenya, in Tanga and Pwani. So a number of community partners, obviously including project participants, women in particular, in our seaweed, mangrove, and forest conservation groups, and critically their male counterparts. We are working with schools, school administration and school children themselves, women's rights organizations, youth-led organizations, and influential community change agents. Key stakeholders of ours, of course, would be the government. So we're working very, very closely with KEMFRI, which is a Kenya Marine Fisheries and Research Institute, Kenya Forest Research Institute, and Kenya Forest Services, among others. So the 3 main project outcomes, very briefly, of COSME involve nature-based solutions, social and financial assets building for women in particular, and climate governance for community resilience. So today, obviously, we'll be speaking about our first pillar around nature-based solutions, but important just to note that there are other pillars supporting the participation and benefit of project participants, women in particular, in these nature-based solutions through a number of other interventions in the project. So here are COSME's 3 nature-based solutions. The first is sustainable seaweed production. So we are building on the experience of a pilot project or a smaller project in one county in Kenya that increased the capacity of women's seaweed groups and cooperatives to undertake sustainable seaweed production. This project will see, hopefully, the production of that seaweed, the amount produced rise, but also introduce some value addition and commercialization opportunities for 20 seaweed groups, 85% which are made up of women. The next nature-based solution is community-based forest management, or CBFM. So we are taking lessons from our partner, the Jane Goodall Institute of Tanzania, who do wonderful work in this area, and so applying the work that they've done in CBFM in Tanzania, in transborder and coastal forests in Tanzania, in Kenya. And lastly, we are working in mangrove restoration, but not just mangrove restoration, a particular approach to mangrove restoration, which is community-based ecological mangrove restoration, or CBEMR, just adding to our acronyms list here today. So in the last NBS, as I mentioned, that's the focus of what we'll be talking about today. But we're looking to increase the capacity of communities, especially women, to undertake community-centered mangrove restoration. We'll be working with 40 groups within the 2 counties in Kenya, as I mentioned. Why this is important in particular, there's evidence to show that at least 40%, if not encroaching on 50% of all mangroves in Kenya have been degraded, badly degraded. And the conventional or traditional means of doing mangrove restoration has been largely inadequate and has not been successful. So key to introduce this new concept, which has been piloted in certain areas, but we're trying to mainstream this now across all of Kenya's mangrove restoration. That's why we're working so closely with the research institutes and academic organizations to then mainstream this moving forward. The caveat here being, of course, as I mentioned, we've not yet implemented. This is the sort of aspirational approach that we're looking to take in the project. So what is CBEMR? Like community-based forest management, it's a participatory approach, ecosystems-based approach where the community is actively engaged in the management and conservation of forests. In coastal Kenya, community-based forest management includes both terrestrial and mangrove forests. But we're going to speak today, as I mentioned, about mangrove restoration, community-based ecological mangrove restoration, which is a subset to CBFM. Two key principles to this mangrove restoration approach. The first being having a good grounding understanding of the ecological conditions for mangrove restoration. So that's looking at the hydrology, the sediment dynamics, the land use, et cetera. Basically identifying and seeking to rectify the underlying causes of the degradation in the first place. So it goes beyond simply planting mangroves, which has been certainly documented as one of the contributing factors to this unsuccessful mangrove restoration in Kenya so far. And looking at planting as only really a last resort, or a resort that's only deployed if long-term monitoring shows that it's truly necessary. We've been working very closely with the senior research scientist at Kemfree, who's also the chairperson of the National Mangrove Management Committee in Kenya. And she could tell us story after story of mangrove sites that have been so-called rehabilitated or restored, and only to have to return 2 years later to redo the work yet again and to replant for a number of reasons. But mainly because sort of the underlying socio-ecological conditions were not well understood or considered in those restoration efforts. So wrong species of mangroves were planted within that targeted site, or that targeted site itself may have not been the best place to try and restore mangroves on intertidal mudflats, et cetera, or other areas that are just not conducive or ought not to have mangroves there in the first place. So that's why this community-based approach, is one to look at those ecological conditions as a key principle. And the next, of course, is community participation, why we're all here speaking to this today. And to note that local communities, in this case, are engaged at every step of the process, from initial assessments to the ranking of restoration priorities that matter to them in their particular context, in their particular community. And they're involved in, obviously, the implementation or driving the implementation of that restoration activity, and also long-term monitoring. So critical, of course, to this approach is that it's using local knowledge. We've spoken a lot today about indigenous knowledge, and creating buy-in and sustainability of those restoration activities. So very briefly, how does CBEMR differ? I've mentioned a couple of examples, but how does it differ from conventional mangrove restoration or just simply planting trees? As it pertains specifically to community involvement. So obviously, a high degree, high touch, high level of community involvement through CBEMR versus potentially more top-down or interventions where community members are much less involved. And through that engagement, the knowledge and expertise, the indigenous knowledge is combined with scientific knowledge, Western knowledge, that in more traditional, conventional restoration, perhaps may not consider to the fullest extent. Critically, land use considerations. So again, examples where mangroves have been planted, but behind them inland, those activities have not been taken well into consideration. So land use considerations form a critical piece of the puzzle for this particular approach, such that the restoration activities are well integrated within those land use practices and regulations along the coast of Kenya. And finally, again, all tied to community engagement and support of communities and buy-in is that of livelihood. So the CBEMR seeks to not only support, but also enhance local livelihoods through ecosystem services that can be provided by healthy mangrove forests. Whereas more conventional restoration might overlook the impact of planting or changing up that particular site such that local livelihoods are impacted. So what are the main steps in CBEMR? So again, coming back to community orientation, community involvement in Kenya, that looks like engaging local communities through mangrove groups or conservation groups. So these groups are ideally registered as community forest associations within the Kenya Forest Service, and that's an important component to this because it gives a formalization and legitimacy to these groups. And it's an important step towards the co-management of these mangrove ecosystems. And it also helps these community actions align with county or even national plans. And also just to mention that these CFAs or community forest associations are actually embedded within Kenya's Forest Conservation and Management Act. So members of these groups are then made aware of the rights and responsibilities of CFAs, but also of the benefits and of the opportunities to them by being part of these more formalized groups. So the COSME project will be working very closely with these groups that may not yet be formally integrated into CFAs and work to ensure that they are registered and also critically that there is female representation, that women are represented in the leadership of these CFAs, where historically it's been primarily men. So the next step is around, once those groups are formed, the site assessments, so doing field walks and conducting detailed assessments of these mangrove sites. And community members themselves, can bring up local knowledge and identify the causes of degradation themselves. And then on the basis of those causes, communities will develop, based on a prioritized list of restoration activities, restoration plans, and then implement those plans. Again, they're under the CFA, the Community Forest Association structure. There's potentially access to funding as well that comes to the county level, but all of this is, it's required to be in a formal group in order to access those funds. So that's another part of what we'll be doing as COSME, is seeing how we can help members of these groups, whether it's mangroves or otherwise, access funding initiatives such that they can then fund their the restoration activities. And then finally, monitoring and management, and ideally adaptive management of these plans. So community managers themselves, they're involved in restoring and monitoring the restoration progress and adapting strategies as needed based on their context in their sites for long-term success. Some documented challenges, and this is not necessarily in Kenya, but in other countries, in Asia in particular, where the approach has been used a bit more widely. I've said it before, but again, a lack of understanding of land usage has been a challenge and often bypassed within this process. So yet again, there have been failures in mangroves where they're planted in inappropriate areas or they're just otherwise unsustainable. And for overcoming normative or the normal means of restoring mangroves. So again, simple planting we see everywhere. Even in our own photos that we use for this, I recognize that every photo I've used, it's everyone planting mangroves. And so, how do we move beyond that and recognize, as I said, that planting mangroves, it should be a last resort, and that mangrove ecosystems can restore themselves, again, if those underlying causes of degradation are addressed. So, again, I'm coming back to the COSME project. I think, we would have done well probably to look at a slew of different indicators for success of our mangrove restoration activities. Critically, that around the measuring the sociocultural value of mangroves within the community. So how through this process has there been a change in how communities value these mangroves and as an indicator of longer term success for these restoration activities. And then critically, the third challenge is around near-term sustainable livelihoods. So obviously, I think we know mangroves are slow growing. It takes quite a long time for these forests to mature and for any ecosystem services to be available as a result of the restoration activities. So how can we support communities rather than cutting mangroves and using it for charcoal or for other activities that can be harmful? If we're saying let's preserve these because long term it will be for a greater good. How can we stem that period or bridge that period of time? And so I think the recommendation or the best practices is to ensure that there's more immediate economic activities that are sort of wraparound to this approach, so that while communities are awaiting sort of the longer term ecological benefits, they're also able to maintain their livelihoods. And so in COSME, this involves our seaweed farming, as I mentioned. So seaweed farming, seaweed can be harvested quite rapidly. So within 35 to 45 days, women are able to, to dry and sell their seaweed and earn an income from that. We're also looking at building in sustainable alternative livelihoods that are derived from the mangroves as they grow, whether that be beekeeping or other activities. There's a good example and sort of something to aspire towards, where there's a group in Kenya, a conservation group of women who have they've built up a boardwalk along their mangrove forests that they've preserved, and it's now an ecotourism site. So people will come and they'll pay this community group essentially to have a beautiful nature walk through their mangroves. And so that obviously provides significant income, but then also the imperative to these communities to hold on to those restoration activities. I know we're running out of time, so very briefly, what has PLAN's experience been in CBEMR so far? What is our success story? Well, it's a bit nascent. I mentioned earlier, the COSME project is built upon a pilot project in one county, and that was the Quality Coastal Livelihoods and Environmental Management Project, implemented in Quality County. And so one of the objectives of this project was to enhance mangrove growth and prevent mangrove deforestation and degradation through participatory approaches by communities. So the project works, it's very, very small, I'm sorry, but with 6 mangrove groups or mangrove communities, encompassing 700 women, 700 men, and a number of young people. And through this project, they were able to restore 65 hectares of mangrove, which did in this case involve planting. So they did plant 290,000 seedlings within these 2 sub-counties of Quality County. We are trying to build in the COSME project on this success. We are scaling up to 40 mangrove groups, so up from 6 to 40. We're spreading it across 2 counties, so we're scaling up to Kilifi County rather than just focusing on Kwale. We're working closely, as I mentioned, with our government partners to create, the first time in Kenya, a CBEMR training manual. So this will become part of the government, a co-branded but really government-owned training resource, so that all future mangrove groups can go through this training program in a cohesive, sort of coherent manner. As I mentioned, critically, we're also looking to build the leadership capacities of women within these groups to take on leadership roles within the community forest associations. I do have a short video, it's 2 minutes, but I realize we're also very much over time. So happy to share out other resources on this topic if folks are interested, but I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Annick. And no quiz, no more acronym quizzes. But it was very interesting to hear about the differences between regular restoration and community-based ecological mangrove restoration. So thank you very much for those perspectives. We could take maybe one question from the audience and perhaps one online. Anyone in the room have a burning question? Or alternatively, anyone online? I just pause for a minute and see if our Aga Khan Foundation colleagues have been able to take any questions online.
The question that we have online, I think this is related to an earlier presentation. So it says, when there's a fusion of scientific and indigenous knowledge, has the indigenous knowledge undergone scientific validation? How is this distinction made and the recognition given to indigenous knowledge in this process? Also, you did mention children as one of the stakeholders. Please highlight how have children been engaged in the entire process?
Great. I'm going to turn to our colleagues online and see if they have a response to this question. So either Alessia or Alexandra.
Sure. Regarding the indigenous knowledge, there's no need for scientific validation. They have a value in itself. So we have, while we do the diagnosis of the practices and the cultural values that they praise, so we make sure that they are heard at the same level as other different knowledges. They have, for instance, the support of the technical assistance and of institutions such as universities that can support them. But we value the knowledge they have as an ancestral knowledge, right? And there is no involvement of children, only youth. Rural youth is one of our main target groups. Here, it depends on the country, but here in Brazil, they are people from 15 to 29 years old. So I hope I have answered the question. I don't know if Alexia wants to complement.
Thank you, Alexandra. No, I think it was a great answer. And maybe just to bring a practical example, whenever we are supporting communities in preparing CRCVPs and once the diagnostics have been done, first of all, there's always local experts that are involved. And I think they're really key because they're able to bridge between the different types of knowledge. For example, when I was working in Sudan, we would have local experts, agronomists who would know very well the context and indigenous knowledge as well, but at the same time, they're also trained as agronomists, so they have the scientific base as well, so they're able to bridge. But yeah, as Alexandra said, then the design of, any adaptive action is, rooted within the community's capacities, the status of the ecosystem. There's several elements that come in place. So I don't think there's a need really to distinguish different types of knowledge, but actually to bridge between them to make sure that we're getting something that is really rooted in the community and then brings, adaptive capacity. Over from my side.
Great, thank you so much, Alessia and Alexandra. I wonder if there are any other questions that our presenters might answer. Charles, please.
Yes, my question is for Aaron, but maybe Alexa also. It's about the land governance, land tenure as a whole. When we hear about the restoration of degraded lands and all of that, in what governance framework, land governance framework are community restoring land? Do communities have land rights? Are they having secured access and control or rights over these lands? And is that playing in terms of how communities are mobilizing to restore the land? If they do restore the land, do they have ownership of the land? What kind of ownership do they have over the lands that they are restoring and investing on? So I just want to hear the challenges around land governance and the restoration efforts that you are working with communities.
That's a good question. Like I mentioned before, we work in so many different contexts that it's always changing in terms of land governance and land ownership, but it's about working with stakeholders who do have access to land, identifying who has the land to work on, right? So we can't, if there's land issues, and those obviously need to be dealt with before we do any implementation of projects, right? Understanding who has access to the land and who benefits from these restoration projects, especially under Revive, that's important to understand. We can talk later about specific contexts in each country, and we do have other projects that are more around land governance and land mapping. So if we do find that issue, maybe we wouldn't put the Thrive project in that environment in the first place, but it's about understanding or making sure that the most amount of beneficiaries and the most amount of people, especially the most vulnerable people, have access to the success and the benefits of the program. So we don't want to do restoration on a beach, for example, that will be later used for tourism, things like that. So it's understanding the local context.
Great, thank you very much for that. Any interventions from our IFAD colleagues?
No, just to say that I completely agree with Aaron. We share the same approach, and I think I want to thank also the person who asked the question, because this is such a key issue that often gets overlooked. But I think it's really important to understand what is the land governance framework we're actually working in, and I think it's such a key issue as well in terms of sustainability. So really making sure that the benefits then are sustained well beyond our interventions. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, if I can complement, we are in all our projects, we are investing in land titling and regulation, especially for indigenous peoples, and supporting also traditional communities such as the Quilombola, who are Afro-descendants, to have their land right. So that I agree that it's a fundamental, it's a basis for any other investment. But at the same time, we try not to exclude those that didn't have access to land yet. So we target the land reform settlers here in Brazil, which have already acquired some land, but they are not officially the holders. And we support with technical assistance so that they can actually officialize this holding.
Great, thank you for that, Alexandra. I'm just conscious of time, but I would also like to give a chance to hear from Annick on the coastal ecosystems. I am curious about one thing, and that is when you mentioned how it's important not to just focus on planting for the sake of planting. And what is your experience with supporting ecosystems around the mangroves? For example, the tidal mudflats or any other ecosystems that are part of the greater sort of landscape, seascape. How do you see communities valuing those spaces, and what are your plans for the larger seascape?
Thank you for that. Yeah, so we've taken an approach to work in both terrestrial and coastal communities, largely for that reason. So understanding that both mangroves and seaweed are heavily impacted by what happens onshore. And so that's why a lot of the work that we're doing, we're almost 50-50 terrestrial and coastal communities for that reason. So we're doing a lot of work in terrestrial communities through the community-based forest management, but other activities as well, such that we're, so that we're aware of, and where we have influence can impact impact on the land use that is, potentially upstream from what happens there and down into the coastal areas. So, again, we're working predominantly with these conservation groups, but we're also working very closely with women's rights organizations and youth-led organizations who are engaged in broader climate and environmental issues, making them aware and supporting them on climate and environmental rights work. And so, through their work and through identification, through their constituents and their members of areas or activities that are impacting the coastal, ecosystem, our hope is that they are able then to voice those concerns through their advocacy efforts to county or even potentially regional or national bodies, to bring the voice of their constituents, of their members in those areas that are being impacted by activities that are inland, but then maybe, as I said, impacting on seaweed farms, for example. There's a good example of that. There's a mine that's operating upstream from one of the seaweed farms, from a number of the seaweed farms, and that, in addition to the massive rains that fell due to El Nino, wiped out 80% of the seaweed farms with whom we intend to work. So that's sort of the starting point for us, and just really indicative of the fact that runoff, agricultural runoff, mining, pollution that comes as a result of these climatic events is a real threat to the project. And so how can we shore up the seaweed farmers, for example, to anticipate these types of events, whether that's by moving their farms further offshore, developing more resilient seaweed varietals, et cetera. But what are some adaptive management mechanisms that we can work on with these seaweed farming groups to anticipate these types of events inland and in other ecosystems that have that sort of downstream effect? So we're doing what we can.
Great, thank you so much. So at this point, I think we'll wrap up our Q&A so we can leave some time to hear some closing remarks from Global Affairs Canada and then move on to our networking session. So I have the pleasure of introducing Kerry Max. So many of you know, he is Deputy Director and Senior Advisor of Climate Finance Partnerships in the Partnerships for Development Innovation Branch. And Kerry comes here with a lot of experience in international development practice, policy, and programming. And he is focused on gender-responsive climate finance to leverage private sector investments in this area. So welcome, Kerry, and yeah, take it away.
Thank you, Veronica. The enviable task of standing between you and not cocktails, but some fruit and munchies. So as you've already heard, many of us in the room spent this morning exchanging perspectives on partnering for climate as part of the IUCN's Nature-Based Solutions Monitoring and Accompaniment Project, NABSA. Ces activités nous ont permis de mieux connaître l'IUCN, la façon dont les solutions fondées sur la nature sont définies et comprises, et la façon dont la norme mondiale peut être utilisée pour mieux aligner des activités et des rapports sur les meilleures pratiques internationales. This is exactly what Global Affairs Canada was hoping would happen when we included funding for NABSA through climate finance. We see NABSA and other climate change capacity building and knowledge sharing projects like IISD's Nature for Climate Adaptation initiative as essential investments to promote the promise and practice of nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation. Et c'est ce même objectif qui est poursuivi dans cette communauté de pratique qui sert de forum pour l'échange des connaissances. Elle est l'expression de notre engagement collectif à promouvoir et à soutenir les efforts des individus et des organisations qui travaillent dans ce domaine. It's also a manifestation of Global Affairs Canada's commitment to go beyond funding nature-based solutions projects and also include active outreach and engagement efforts to ensure that the results that you as a community are helping to achieve are widely known and can contribute to the efforts of others to attain their development objectives in the most effective and efficient ways possible. Nous avons contribué à la réalisation de cet engagement grâce à la discussion de cet après-midi, au cours de laquelle nous avons tous et toutes approfondi notre compréhension des questions liées à la terminologie des peuples autochtones et des communautés locales
Et nous avons entendu parler de certaines approches très utiles en matière d'engagement des communautés qui permettent de concevoir sur mesure des solutions fondées sur la nature qui correspondent aux besoins et aux opportunités locales. And the learning and exchanges will continue tomorrow, next door at Global Affairs Canada, when we'll have a chance to discuss with Graham Reed and Stewart Maginnis once again on issues related to Indigenous perspectives and the global standard. We'll also hear from 5 more Partnering for Climate projects partners and the IISD and IUCN on their projects. Today's and tomorrow's discussions also illustrate how important it is for this community of practice and other knowledge-sharing initiatives to discuss our successes and failures in an honest and transparent way, building on each other and each of them to improve outcomes for people and the planet, whether that's a better informed and more sensitive approach to communities and their distinct needs and rights, improved techniques for building coastal resilience, or a new and improved global standard that better reflects the rights and knowledge of Indigenous peoples. And speaking of successes, I wanted to do a quick shout out to encourage all of you to subscribe and listen to Farm Radio International's Nature Answers podcast that was launched today, bringing together the voices of young Canadian journalists and the women, men, and youth of Kenya, Uganda, and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa as they share their lived experiences in using nature-based solutions to overcome key development challenges related to climate change. I especially liked hearing about the forested mango grove that reduced wind damage to local communities while providing much-needed income to women and youth. Et je comprends qu'une version française du podcast sera disponible un peu plus tard. Finally, and before I hand over to Georgia for an important Mentimeter exercise, I wanted to convey Global Affairs Canada's appreciation for everyone that's made today's events possible. To AKFC for their wonderful facilities and the support of their staff, to Veronica Lo for some very early matchmaking and logistical support that she provided to IUCN, and to the entire IISD and IUCN teams that have worked tirelessly to organize this event and have flown in from across the world to contribute. Et je tiens à vous remercier tous et toutes dans la salle et en ligne de continuer à unir vos forces et à renforcer nos connaissances et nos capacités collectives. J'ai hâte de vous voir demain et dans les événements futurs. Georgia, over to you.
This is just our website, so if you do have any further feedback or you want to ask any questions, please go to ncai.iisd.org. There's a contact form there. And if you'd like to join the community of practice and you haven't already, please go to that email and let us know. So thank you guys. I'll throw it back to Carrie to open. No, all right, we're networking now. Enjoy the evening. Thank you, everybody.